We are back now with Overtime with Representative Perry, who's the House Democratic leader. Jordan, why don't you start the conversation?
I was just curious, again, going back to this roundtable with Speaker Hall yesterday, we talked a lot about transparency. However, when asked about Freedom of Information Acts, extending the governor and legislature to be open to public records requests, he seemed to really pump the brakes on that, saying that was not an immediate priority of his and instead listed a number of other things like closing the lawmaker to lobbyist pipeline. I was just curious if I could get your reaction on him seemingly putting FOIA to the side for right now.
Well, I think that's a mistake. And I think, when you are running the show in the Michigan House as the speaker, these are the decisions you have to make. You can't just kind of rely on messaging anymore. And so this is something that they've said that they would be supportive in the past. I know that the Senate is interested in moving this issue. And so Matt Hall will have a decision on his hand. And I hope he does support the FOIA legislation.
If Democrats are so interested in that, why didn't it happen while Democrats had full control of the process?
Yeah, well, it's, that is a question for former Speaker Tate. I know that there's a number in my caucus. Including myself, that are very supportive of the initiative.
Representative, what's your stance on this TIP stuff? Are you guys going to play ball, or are the unions leaning on you and say don't?
Look, like if I'm, the House Democrats will be ready. I think, the fortunate thing about the situation that we find ourselves as House Democrats is that different than the prior terms is we do have a Democratic Senate, we do have a Democratic governor, and so we have the luxury of working kind of in unison and making sure that the legislation that's coming out of the House is going to be meeting the needs of both of those stools of this the legs of this stool. And so with this issue, I know that there's a number of opinions on our side. We're kind of waiting to see where the overall negotiation goes, but I think obviously there's plenty on our side that are happy with where things are at and don't want to see a change. But the dynamics of Lansing aren't as such. And so we will engage in the conversation as needed.
You're an individual lawmaker. You represent 90,000 people in the state capitol. What do you think the tip wage should be?
I think we should follow the will of the people. I think
100%.
That
you think it should be 100%?
Well, yes. Like I'm more aligned to seeing it be over there. We've seen this happen in other states. I think that some of the talking points aren't completely accurate, or in line with how this has played out in other states. And so, that's for me personally, my politics, that's where I would be.
One of the levers that minority caucuses have is taking a united caucus position on something. Do you think that you could get a caucus position on the minimum wage and the earned sick time?
Yeah, the caucus position is something that it's a lever that we didn't use. To be candid, we didn't use a whole lot the last 2 years. So we have a number of caucus members that just haven't gone through that process. With an issue like this, I think we're going to continue to canvass the caucus just to see where they're at. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there is a spectrum of opinions on this. And so, I think first and foremost, we would want to talk to our colleagues and kind of just understand broadly where the caucus is at, and then go from there.
Okay, but you did actually say that there was a diversity of opinion. Do you think that you can come to a caucus position on those issues?
I don't see why we couldn't. But again, I'm not speaking for the caucus on this issue yet. I think this is something that would require a level of conversation, amongst the 52 of us, just to kind of broadly see where we're all at. I think there's an inkling, there's speculation, but this isn't something that we've talked as a group in whole yet.
Representative, can we fix the roads without raising new revenue?
I don't think that's possible, personally. With my understanding of the budget and my time as the chair of the subcommittee on transportation, obviously things change, but from the industry experts that I was talking to, the fiscal shortfall seems to be in the range of about $3.9 billion annually. I just think that number is too large to overcome by robbing Peter to pay Paul in the budget. And so if there's a way to do it, again, like this is a conversation that I'm intimately familiar with. I would, if there's a way to do it, I would love to be a part of that. But in my honest opinion, I think new revenue is needed.
Do you have a plan in mind?
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole bunch of options that are on the table. We have engaged in conversations of piecing this together. I think it's really just understanding what the political appetite in Lansing is for that. But yes, we are absolutely ready to engage in that conversation.
But
Do you have a plan in mind?
In the works, yes, we are building out a plan.
But it will not include a gas tax hike. Is that a fair statement?
I don't think that's the route we will go. The reality is if you want to raise revenue, there's not there's nothing unique about Michigan in the sense that there's really only 5 or 6 really ways to do it. And in most of the plans, if you're trying, depending on kind of what number you're anchoring at the top of what your goal is of how much you're trying to raise or bring in, there really isn't one solution that's going to get you all the way there. And so I'm just for conversation's sake, if we were trying to get to the $3.9 billion fiscal shortfall to fill up that gap completely, you would need multiple levers to get that done. And so I don't know if the political appetite there is to meet that number or meet in the middle somewhere. So it really just depends on, I guess, where you're trying to go. And then a plan then subsequently would follow based on that.
In your speech, you talking about petty politics and coming together in a bipartisan way. Last term, Democrats were not shy about using their majority to push through legislation that they backed and frequently didn't hold public comment on committees. Republicans now have an even greater majority in the House. What reason do they have to engage in bipartisanship with you?
I would push back on that a little bit. I wouldn't say by and large that we didn't hold public comment in the last term. I think for an overwhelming majority of the bills that were voted out of the House, they went through the committee process.
The big ones like right to work were not given any kind of public comment. Those were just pushed through respectfully.
Was there not a committee hearing on right to work?
The public comment section, though, was pretty quickly done over with. And I know that was a point that Speaker Hall brought up yesterday in the roundtable as well, is the letting the committee process go through with public comment and giving people their time to say their piece. Just again, curious, having gone through that, you talk about bipartisanship. The last 2 years were a little rough for that. Why now do Republicans need to engage with the Democratic caucus, considering it wasn't necessarily reciprocal the last 2 years?
Again, I'm not an institutionalist that's been around for 20 years, but in my limited time, I don't think that the last 2 years under Democratic control were far different from previous terms that I've been around. And so I think that there was a great deal of precedent and tradition that was honored. And I think that there was a good amount of respect that was given to the minority caucus last term. And so, I just kind of expect the same here as the ways it's always been. The majority has changed, obviously, in the flip, and as you brought up, the numbers and the gap has expanded, but it expanded by a couple seats. And so it's not like, we're at 70 to 40. Here, it's still very much a close electorate. I think it still represents where Michigan's at. It's still a very divided and purple state, and so I think that the way that we govern should respect and honor that.
Representative, thank you for your time and for being on Off the Record. We appreciate it, sir. Who's your candidate for governor?
Let's wait till the filing deadline.
Oh, yeah, that's a punt. That's all right, we'll give you one. Representative, it's good to see you. Have a good weekend, okay? Thank you, sir.
Have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. See you next week, folks.